In the bustling postal offices of Imperial Berlin, where the efficient machinery of German bureaucracy processed thousands of letters and packages daily, a clerk named Klaus Hartmann lived what appeared to be an unremarkable life until a simple act of charity revealed one of medicine's most extraordinary secrets. When Klaus donated blood to help save an injured colleague in 1906, laboratory technicians discovered something that challenged the very foundations of human biology. His blood contained two distinct genetic signatures, as if two different people were sharing the same circulatory system. The investigation that followed would reveal that Klaus was a human chimera, a living fusion of two embryos who had merged in the womb, making him literally two people in one body. The discovery would force him to confront the disturbing possibility that his thoughts, his personality, even his sense of self, might be shared with the genetic remnants of a brother he had unknowingly absorbed before birth, raising profound questions about identity, consciousness, and what it truly means to be a single, unified human being. The Berlin of 1906 was the pulsing heart of the German Empire, a city that embodied the confidence and ambition of a nation at the height of its power. Under Kaiser Wilhelm II, Germany had become Europe's dominant industrial force, and Berlin reflected this prosperity in its grand boulevards, imposing government buildings, and the bustling activity of its commercial districts. The city stretched across the North German plain like a vast organism, its arteries of railway lines and telegraph cables connecting it to every corner of the empire and beyond. The Spree River wound through the urban landscape, its banks lined with factories, warehouses, and the grand buildings that housed the machinery of imperial administration. The Mitte district, where Klaus worked, was the administrative center of the empire, housing the postal headquarters that coordinated communication across Germany's vast territories. The Imperial Post Office was a marvel of organizational efficiency, employing thousands of clerks, sorters, and delivery personnel who ensured that letters and packages reached their destinations with clockwork precision. The Postal Service was more than just a government agency. It was a symbol of German technological and administrative superiority, connecting the farthest reaches of the empire through an intricate network of offices, telegraph lines, and railway connections. Workers in the Postal Service took pride in their role as guardians of the empire's communications, and they were generally well-respected members of the middle class. The main postal building on Französische Straße was an imposing structure of red brick and limestone that reflected the architectural confidence of the Wilhelmina era. Its vast sorting halls were filled with the constant activity of workers processing mail, the clicking of telegraph keys, and the rumble of pneumatic tubes that carried messages between departments with mechanical efficiency. Klaus Hartmann had joined the Postal Service in 1895 at the age of 23, after completing his education at a technical school in his hometown of Dresden. He was the son of a clockmaker, raised in a household that valued precision, reliability, and attention to detail, qualities that served him well in his postal career. Klaus's father, Johann Hartmann, had been a master clockmaker whose workshop was renowned throughout Dresden for the quality and accuracy of its timepieces. The Hartmann family had been involved in precision crafts for generations, and Klaus had grown up surrounded by the intricate mechanisms and delicate adjustments that characterized his father's work. From childhood, Klaus had displayed an unusual ability to understand complex systems and to identify patterns that others missed. His father had hoped that Klaus would follow him into the clockmaking trade, but the young man had been drawn to the broader scope and greater opportunities offered by government service. Klaus's mother, Greta, had been a seamstress who possessed an exceptional eye for detail and an almost supernatural ability to detect flaws in fabric or stitching that were invisible to others. She had passed on to Klaus her meticulous nature and her capacity for sustained concentration on detailed work. The family had lived modestly but comfortably in a small house near Dresden's Old Town, where Klaus had attended the local gymnasium and excelled in mathematics and natural sciences. His teachers had noted his exceptional memory and his ability to absorb and retain complex information, though they had also observed that he sometimes seemed distracted or preoccupied, as if his attention were divided between the classroom and some internal world that only he could perceive. Klaus was known among his colleagues as a methodical and dependable worker who rarely missed a day of work, and who could be counted on to handle even the most complex sorting tasks with accuracy and efficiency. He lived alone in a modest apartment near the postal headquarters, having never married, despite several romantic relationships that had failed to develop into lasting commitments. His apartment on Rosenthaler Strasse was spartanly furnished, but meticulously organized, reflecting the same attention to detail that characterized his work. Klaus had arranged his possessions with mathematical precision, creating an environment of order and predictability that seemed to provide him with comfort and security. His colleagues found Klaus to be somewhat reserved and introspective, though not unfriendly. He was the type of person who listened more than he spoke, who observed the world around him with quiet intensity, and who seemed to possess an unusual depth of understanding about human nature that was surprising in someone with his limited formal education. Klaus participated in the social activities of the postal service, the annual picnics, the Christmas celebrations, the retirement parties, but he always seemed slightly apart from the group, as if he were observing the festivities from a distance even when he was physically present. His colleagues attributed this to shyness or perhaps to the reserved nature that was common among people from Saxony. Klaus had always been aware that he was somehow different from other people, though he could never articulate exactly what made him feel this way. He experienced occasional moments of confusion about his own identity, as if he were observing his life from outside himself, watching someone else make decisions and live experiences that felt both familiar and foreign. These feelings of disconnection were particularly strong when Klaus looked at himself in mirrors or photographs. He would sometimes stare at his reflection for long periods, trying to understand why his own face seemed somehow unfamiliar, as if he were looking at a stranger who happened to share his features. The sensation was most pronounced when Klaus examined his eyes, which seemed to contain depths and complexities that he could not fathom. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of expressions or emotions in his reflection that felt alien to his conscious mind, as if another personality were looking back at him from behind his own features. Klaus also experienced vivid dreams that seemed to belong to someone else, memories of places he had never been, conversations with people he had never met, and emotions that felt authentic but had no basis in his actual life experiences. These dreams were often more vivid and emotionally intense than his waking experiences, and they frequently featured a shadowy figure who seemed familiar, but whom he could never quite identify. In one recurring dream, Klaus found himself in a workshop that was similar to his father's, but subtly different in its layout and equipment. In this dream, he possessed skills and knowledge that he did not have in waking life, and he worked alongside the shadowy figure in perfect harmony, as if they were two parts of a single consciousness. He had learned to dismiss these dreams as products of an overactive imagination, but they continued to trouble him with their clarity and emotional intensity. Sometimes he would wake from these dreams with tears on his face, mourning for losses he could not name or remember. Klaus also experienced occasional episodes of what he privately called double consciousness, moments when he seemed to be aware of two different streams of thought or emotion occurring simultaneously within his mind. During these episodes, he would find himself holding contradictory opinions or feeling conflicting emotions about the same situation, as if two different people were sharing his consciousness. These experiences were brief and infrequent, but they left Klaus with a persistent sense of unease about the nature of his own identity. He had never mentioned these phenomena to anyone, fearing that he would be considered mentally unstable or that his career might be jeopardized if his supervisors learned of his psychological peculiarities. The incident that would change Klaus's life forever occurred on March 15, 1906, when his colleague Friedrich Weber was severely injured in an accident involving a mail sorting machine. Friedrich had been working late to process a backlog of packages when his sleeve became caught in the machinery, resulting in a crushed arm and significant blood loss that required immediate medical attention. Friedrich was a popular figure in the postal service, known for his cheerful disposition and his willingness to help colleagues with difficult tasks. He was married with 3 young children, and the news of his accident sent shockwaves through the entire postal community. Klaus was among the first to respond to Friedrich's cries for help, and he accompanied his colleague to the Charité Hospital, Berlin's premier medical institution. The Charité was one of Europe's most advanced hospitals, equipped with the latest medical technology and staffed by some of Germany's most distinguished physicians. The attending physician, Dr. Heinrich Müller, was a specialist in trauma surgery who had trained at the University of Berlin and had gained experience treating industrial accidents that were becoming increasingly common in Germany's rapidly industrializing economy. Dr. Müller determined that Friedrich would require immediate surgery and a blood transfusion to replace the blood he had lost during the accident. Blood transfusion was still a relatively new and risky procedure in 1906, having been developed only a few years earlier following the discovery of blood types by Karl Landsteiner. The process required careful testing to ensure that the recipient's blood would not reject the donated blood, a reaction that could be fatal if incompatible blood types were mixed. Klaus immediately volunteered to donate blood, as did several other postal workers who had gathered at the hospital to support their injured colleague. The postal service had a strong tradition of mutual support among its employees, and it was not uncommon for workers to make personal sacrifices to help their colleagues in times of need. The blood typing process was conducted by the hospital's laboratory technician, Hermann Schneider, who had been trained in the latest techniques for determining blood compatibility. Schneider was a meticulous worker who took pride in the accuracy of his laboratory results and who had never encountered a case of blood typing that he could not resolve. Schneider drew samples from each potential donor and began the process of testing them against Friedrich's blood to identify suitable matches. The testing involved mixing small amounts of donor blood with Friedrich's blood and observing the reactions under a microscope to determine compatibility. When Schneider examined Klaus's blood sample under the microscope, he noticed something that seemed impossible according to everything he had learned about human blood. The sample appeared to contain 2 distinct populations of red blood cells that reacted differently to the testing sera, as if the blood had come from 2 different people. The first population of cells showed the characteristics of type A blood, clumping together when exposed to anti-A serum, but remaining separate when exposed to anti-B serum. However, a second population of cells in the same sample showed the characteristics of type O blood, failing to clump with either anti-A or anti-B sera. Schneider initially assumed that the sample had been contaminated or mislabeled, so he requested a fresh sample from Klaus and repeated the test with meticulous care. He used new equipment, fresh sera, and took extra precautions to prevent contamination, but the second test produced identical results. The finding was so contrary to established medical knowledge that Schneider consulted with Dr. Müller, who was equally puzzled by the results. Blood types had been discovered only a few years earlier, and the scientific understanding of blood compatibility was still evolving, but it was considered a fundamental principle that each person could have only one blood type. Dr. Müller examined the test results himself and confirmed Schneider's findings. Klaus's blood indeed contained two distinct cell populations with different antigenic properties, a phenomenon that violated everything they understood about human biology and genetics. The immediate medical crisis required that Friedrich receive a transfusion from one of the other donors, but Dr. Müller was intrigued by Klaus's unusual blood and requested permission to conduct additional tests. Klaus agreed, partly out of curiosity about his condition and partly out of a desire to contribute to medical knowledge that might help future patients. Dr. Müller decided to refer Klaus to Dr. Wilhelm Weinberg at the Institute for Hereditary Biology, one of Germany's leading research centers for the study of human genetics and inheritance patterns. Dr. Weinberg was internationally recognized for his work on genetic variation and had access to the most advanced laboratory techniques available at the time. The Institute for Hereditary Biology was housed in a modern building near the University of Berlin, equipped with state-of-the-art laboratories and research facilities. The institute had been established to study the mechanisms of heredity and to advance German understanding of genetics and eugenics, fields that were considered crucial to the nation's scientific and racial superiority. Klaus was initially reluctant to undergo extensive medical testing, as he was concerned about missing work and about the potential implications of whatever the doctors might discover. However, his curiosity about his unusual blood eventually overcame his reservations, and he agreed to participate in Dr. Weinberg's research. Dr. Weinberg was a distinguished scientist who had made significant contributions to the understanding of population genetics and inheritance patterns. He was particularly interested in cases of genetic variation that could shed light on the mechanisms of human development and evolution. Dr. Weinberg's examination of Klaus began with a comprehensive medical history and physical examination, followed by extensive blood tests that confirmed the hospital's initial findings. Klaus's blood indeed contained two distinct cell populations with different genetic markers, a phenomenon that Dr. Weinberg had never encountered in his years of research. The blood tests revealed that approximately 60% of Klaus's red blood cells were type A, while the remaining 40% were type O. This distribution was consistent throughout multiple samples taken over several weeks, suggesting that the phenomenon was stable and not the result of temporary physiological changes. Intrigued by this unprecedented case, Dr. Weinberg expanded his investigation to include tissue samples from different parts of Klaus's body. Skin biopsies, hair follicles, and even small samples of internal tissue were collected and analyzed to determine whether the genetic anomaly was limited to Klaus's blood or extended throughout his body. The collection of tissue samples was a complex and somewhat painful process that required Klaus to visit the institute multiple times over several months. Each visit involved careful documentation of the sample locations and detailed analysis of the genetic markers present in different tissues. The results of these tests were even more extraordinary than Dr. Weinberg had anticipated. Different parts of Klaus's body showed different genetic profiles, as if he were composed of tissues from multiple individuals. His blood was predominantly type A, but his skin cells were type O. His hair follicles showed yet another genetic signature, and liver tissue revealed DNA patterns that could not be explained by normal inheritance from his parents. Analysis of Klaus's saliva revealed a mixture of genetic markers that corresponded to the different tissue types, while samples from his fingernails showed yet another distinct genetic profile. It was as if Klaus's body was a patchwork of different genetic identities, each contributing to his overall biological function. Dr. Weinberg consulted with colleagues across Europe and reviewed every available piece of literature on genetic anomalies, but he could find no precedent for Klaus's condition. The genetic diversity within a single individual seemed to violate fundamental principles of biology and inheritance The case attracted attention from other researchers, including Professor August Weismann from the University of Freiburg, who was known for his work on heredity and development. Professor Weismann traveled to Berlin to examine Klaus and to review Dr. Weinberg's findings, bringing with him additional expertise in embryological development. After months of research and consultation, Dr. Weinberg developed a theory that would revolutionize the understanding of human development. He proposed that Klaus was a human chimera, an individual who had incorporated genetic material from another person during embryonic development. The most likely explanation, according to Dr. Weinberg's theory, was that Klaus had originally been one of a pair of fraternal twins who had fused during the early stages of pregnancy. Instead of developing as two separate individuals, the embryos had merged, with Klaus absorbing his twin brother's cells and incorporating them throughout his developing body. This process, known as chimerism, had been observed in some animal species, but had never been documented in humans. The theory suggested that Klaus was literally two people in one body, carrying the genetic heritage of both himself and his absorbed twin throughout his tissues and organs. Dr. Weinberg's research revealed that the fusion had occurred very early in embryonic development, probably within the first few weeks after conception. This early timing explained why the genetic material from both embryos was distributed throughout Klaus's body rather than being confined to specific organs or regions. The distribution pattern of the different genetic markers suggested that the fusion had been relatively complete, with cells from both embryos contributing to the development of all major organ systems. This indicated that Klaus's brain, heart, liver, and other vital organs all contained genetic material from both original embryos. When Dr. Weinberg explained his findings to Klaus, the revelation was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The idea that his body contained the genetic remnants of a brother he had never known, that parts of his flesh and blood belonged to someone else, challenged Klaus's fundamental understanding of his own identity. Klaus struggled to comprehend the implications of Dr. Weinberg's discovery. If his brain contained cells from both embryos, did that mean there were two minds sharing his skull? Could his brother's genetic material influence his thoughts, his personality, his very sense of self? Were the strange dreams and feelings of disconnection he had experienced throughout his life actually memories or emotions from his absorbed twin? The psychological impact of learning about his chimeric nature was profound and lasting. Klaus began to question every aspect of his identity, wondering which of his characteristics were truly his own and which might belong to his unknown brother. He found himself studying his reflection obsessively, trying to identify features that might have come from the other embryo. Klaus also became preoccupied with the ethical and philosophical implications of his condition. Was he guilty of fratricide for having absorbed his twin in the womb? Did he have a moral obligation to honor the memory of the brother who had become part of him? How could he live with the knowledge that his very existence had required the death and absorption of another human being? The revelation also explained many of the psychological phenomena that Klaus had experienced throughout his life. The dreams of unfamiliar places and people, the moments of double consciousness, the sense of observing his own life from outside, all of these could potentially be attributed to the presence of his brother's genetic material in his brain and nervous system. Dr. Weinberg was eager to continue his research into Klaus's condition, as the case represented an unprecedented opportunity to study human chimerism and its implications for understanding genetics and development. He proposed additional tests and experiments that could provide valuable insights into how chimeric individuals develop and function. The proposed research included detailed mapping of the genetic distribution throughout Klaus's body, studies of his brain function and psychology, and investigation of his family history to understand how the chimeric condition had developed. Doctor. Weinberg also wanted to study Klaus's reproductive cells to determine whether his children would inherit genetic material from both embryos. However, Klaus became increasingly reluctant to participate in further research. The psychological burden of his discovery was overwhelming, and he found that the constant medical attention and scientific scrutiny made it difficult for him to maintain any sense of normal life. Klaus also became concerned about the potential social implications of his condition becoming widely known. In the Germany of 1906, with its emphasis on racial purity and genetic superiority, being identified as a genetic anomaly could have serious consequences for his career and social standing. The emerging eugenics movement, which sought to improve the human race through selective breeding and the elimination of undesirable genetic traits, viewed genetic anomalies with suspicion and often advocated for the sterilization or isolation of individuals who carried unusual genetic characteristics. After several months of intensive study, Klaus informed Dr. Weinberg that he would no longer participate in the research. He requested that his medical records be kept confidential and that no further information about his case be published without his explicit consent. Dr. Weinberg was disappointed by Klaus's decision, as he believed that continued study of the case could lead to important scientific breakthroughs. However, he respected Klaus's wishes and agreed to maintain confidentiality while preserving tissue samples for potential future research. Klaus returned to his work at the Postal Service and attempted to resume his normal life, but the knowledge of his chimeric nature continued to affect him profoundly. He became even more withdrawn and introspective, spending long hours alone in his apartment, reading philosophy and theology as he tried to understand the meaning of his unique existence. The revelation of his dual nature had shattered Klaus's sense of individual identity and forced him to confront fundamental questions about consciousness, personality, and the nature of self. He began to view himself not as a single person, but as a living memorial to his absorbed brother, carrying within his body the genetic legacy of someone who had never had the chance to live independently. Klaus also developed an intense interest in twin studies and multiple births, reading everything he could find about the psychological and emotional bonds between twins. He wondered whether his absorbed brother had possessed a separate consciousness during their brief shared existence in the womb, and whether some trace of that consciousness might still exist within his own mind. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 provided Klaus with a temporary distraction from his personal struggles. He was drafted into the German army and served as a communications specialist, using his postal experience to help coordinate military communications on the Western Front. The war years were paradoxically some of the most peaceful of Klaus's adult life, as the external chaos and danger provided relief from his internal conflicts about identity and existence. Surrounded by death and destruction, the question of whether he was one person or two seemed less important than simply surviving each day. Klaus served with distinction during the war, earning commendations for his reliability and skill in maintaining communications under difficult conditions. His colleagues in the army found him to be a dependable and competent soldier, though they noted the same reserved and introspective qualities that had characterized his civilian life. The experience of war also provided Klaus with a new perspective on his chimeric condition. Witnessing the deaths of thousands of young men, he began to view his absorption of his twin brother not as a tragedy, but as a form of salvation, a way of ensuring that his brother's genetic legacy would survive and contribute to the world. Klaus survived the war and returned to Berlin in 1918, where he resumed his position with the Postal Service, which was now part of the new Weimar Republic. The political and social upheaval of the post-war period created new challenges, but Klaus adapted to the changing circumstances with the same methodical approach he had always applied to his work. During the 1920s, Klaus lived quietly and anonymously, avoiding medical attention and maintaining minimal social contact. He never married and had no close friends, preferring the solitude that allowed him to avoid questions about his past and his unusual medical history. Klaus did develop a correspondence with several researchers who were studying genetics and human development, though he never revealed his own chimeric condition. He contributed anonymously to scientific discussions about twin development and genetic variation, sharing insights that came from his unique perspective as a living chimera. The rise of the Nazi Party in the 1930s created new anxieties for Klaus, as the regime's emphasis on racial purity and genetic fitness made him acutely aware of the potential consequences if his chimeric nature were discovered. The Nazi eugenics program targeted individuals with genetic anomalies for sterilization, or worse, and Klaus lived in constant fear that his medical records might be discovered. Klaus destroyed all personal documents related to his medical testing and avoided any situation that might require blood tests or medical examinations. He also severed his correspondence with genetic researchers, fearing that any connection to scientific studies might draw unwanted attention to his condition. Klaus continued working for the postal service throughout the Nazi period, keeping his head down and avoiding political involvement. His colleagues knew him as a reliable but unremarkable worker who had somehow managed to avoid military service during World War I due to unspecified medical issues. The preserved tissue samples from Klaus's case remained in Dr. Weinberg's laboratory throughout this period, though the research had been suspended due to Klaus's refusal to participate and the changing political climate that made genetic research increasingly controversial. Klaus Hartmann died quietly in his apartment on November 12, 1943, at the age of 71. His death was attributed to heart failure, and he was buried in a simple ceremony attended only by a few colleagues from the postal service. His landlord found no personal effects of significance, and Klaus appeared to have lived his final years with the same anonymity he had maintained since his medical discovery. Dr. Weinberg, who had continued his research into genetics and heredity throughout his career, preserved Klaus's tissue samples and medical records as part of his scientific legacy. After the war, these materials would become crucial to advancing the understanding of human chimerism and genetic mosaicism. The man who contained two different people teaches us that identity is not simply a matter of genetics or biology, but a complex interplay of physical, psychological, and social factors that shape our understanding of who we are. His story stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the capacity to find meaning and purpose even in the face of the most extraordinary and challenging circumstances.